sound. You didn't get that part. You weren't able to record that part about me saying I was lazy, so that's a good thing. Now you did, so. No, I was looking through his notes, and I decided, he's got pretty much all of it down here, and there are some things that I will do differently than Wayne would do. Unfortunately, you're stuck with me this morning for Bible class, and then tonight for the evening service I'll be preaching. Keith will be speaking this morning. So I thought, well, I'm just going to take Wayne's notes and change them a little bit to suit me, and we'll go with that, because he's a good student of the Bible, and he puts a lot of work into his lessons, and I appreciate that. So looking at chapter 12, beginning, I think we ended we got to about verse 26. I'm going to back up to verse 24, and we'll just finish up chapter 12 very quickly and then move on from there into the next section of 2 Samuel. We have just finished talking about David and his sin with Bathsheba, and how that God had condemned David for this and given him some consequences of his sin. And one of those consequences was a child that was born to this adulterous relationship would die. And we talked a little bit about that Thursday night, so I won't rehash that. But David, it says in verse 24, then comforted his wife Bathsheba and went in to her, and she gave birth to a son whose name is Solomon. Now, Solomon comes from, this is according to scholars of the Hebrew, okay? So how much they know, I don't know. Sometimes there's no relation, but we try to make one. But it comes from the root word shalem, which means complete or whole or sound. And so it could be that this name Solomon was given to this child, indicating that David thought that this child would be sound and the other child was sick. I don't know. But it's interesting sometimes to look at those names and what they mean. At any rate, Jehovah comes in through Nathan the prophet and gives the child another name. Calls him Jedediah. And the word Jedediah, Dia coming from David, and David means beloved one, and Jeddah from Yahweh or Jehovah, loved of the Lord. And so this indicates that God approved of this relationship now. And so somebody might say, well, how can God approve of this relationship? This was the woman David stole from Uriah the Hittite. He murdered her husband to take her, and now God approves of this union? Well, we read when Jesus talked about marriage, death separates the marriage bond. Uriah's dead. There's nothing that can be done to bring him back. It is just as David said about the child who God said would die. After the child died and the servants were amazed that David then got up and ate, David said, I shall go to him, but he shall not come to me. He's dead, he's gone. That part of my life is over. Now David was sorry about that, but that chapter was closed. And so the chapter of Bathsheba's life with Uriah, whether she liked it or not, whether David liked it or not, it was closed. And now she was a widow who was free to marry and had remarried. And so they have to move on from there. And we need to understand that about life. Sometimes it's not, doesn't seem fair, but in fact, that's the way life is. The birth of Solomon hints at a fulfillment of what God told David in chapter 7, verses 12 through 12 through 15 actually. When your days are complete and you lie down with your fathers, I will raise up your descendant after you who will come forth from you, and I will establish his kingdom. He shall build for a house for my name, and I will establish the throne of his kingdom forever. And I will be a father to him, and he will be a son to me. When he commits iniquity, I will correct him with the rod of men and the strokes of the sons of men. But my loving kindness shall not depart from him, as I took it away from Saul, whom I removed from before you. Now, looking at Solomon's life, we see the fulfillment of this prophecy. Solomon started out very good, because God told him at the beginning of his reign, I will give you anything you want. And I'm very loosely paraphrasing here. God said, I'll give you anything you want. What did Solomon ask for? Wisdom to do what? To lead God's people. To do God's will, essentially. To lead His people. It was an unselfish request. And so God not only gave him that, but gave him everything else he could have asked for as well. Well, Solomon then falls away from God. He let the many wives that he married take his heart away from serving God, and he began to serve other gods and began to serve his own pleasures. And I think that the books of Proverbs and Ecclesiastes are evidence that later on in his life, he came back to the Lord and realized the error of his ways. A lot of people disagree with me on that. That's fine. I see that as being possible or probable. And that's as far as I'll go with that. But God said here that even though he would discipline him with the rod of the sons of men, he would never take his loving kindness away from David's son. And so it was through Solomon that he established the lineage of Jesus Christ, the Messiah. And so we see here the fulfillment in Solomon's life of that promise made in 2 Samuel chapter 7. And perhaps we also see in there the foreknowledge of God, that he knew that the son of David was going to get off the path, as it were, and then have to be brought back on the path. David has gotten off the path and had to be brought back on the path. Moving on then to verse 26 of chapter 12. Joab then fights against the city of Rabbah of the sons of Ammon, and he captures this royal city. And he sends word to King David, and this may be, I don't know, there may be something in here about, we talked about at the beginning of the story of David and Bathsheba that when in the spring when kings go out to war, David was at home at the palace. This may be an indication that Joab thought David should have been out at war. Because Joab sends to David and says, I fought against Rabbah, I've captured the city of waters, verse 27. Verse 28, now therefore gather the rest of the people together and camp against the city and capture it, or I will capture the city myself and it will be named after me. Now, he could be here just stating a fact. Or he could be trying to tell David, you need to get to work and do your job and lead this battle and finish it. And maybe he's saying to David here, you should have been out here all along. I don't know. That's speculation. But nonetheless, he tells David, we're ready for the final entry into the city. Get over here and take care of it. Or it's not going to be your conquest, it'll be mine. And so David then comes in and he leads the final conquest of the city. And he captures this crown that it says weighs a talent of gold, and I'm told that a talent of gold would have weighed about what a man would weigh. And Wayne has, with his good math, he has in his notes that would be about $600,000 in today's money. Well, I figured out the weight of a man at around 200 pounds. Maybe that's a little bit over, but when you take 16 ounces to the pound and $1,600 to an ounce of gold, which I think that's probably a little low on the price of gold, you come out to somewhere between about $4 million minimum, probably, to about $6 million maximum that this crown of gold would have been worth. quite a sum of money to put into something you're going to put on your head. And I don't know how somebody could wear something that weighs as much as a man weighs on his head. That would be, I think they'd had to rig that somehow so that it kind of held up there and he just kind of sat underneath it. I don't know. But this was a very wealthy city and a wealthy group of people that David defeated at this time, of course through the hand of God. And it says that he took these people, as wealthy as they were, and he puts them under saws and sharp iron instruments and made them pass through the brick kiln. Now, I don't think that this is really saying that he put them to torture. We talk about in Hebrews that some of the servants of God were sawn asunder, and the way they did this was they would take a man and they would put him in a hollowed out log, and they would take a saw, like a cross-cut saw, and literally saw him in two inside that log. Very gruesome thing to do. I don't think that's what this is talking about. I think this is saying he made slaves out of them. They served the children of Israel by sawing down lumber, by using their iron instruments, and by making bricks for the building projects that David and his son Solomon later on would do. And that would be a typical thing that was done to people who were captured. If anybody has comments, just jump right in. And it may have been even done forcing them to tear down their own fortress after it was captured. Because this was done a lot of times too. You remember when Cyrus, king of Persia, told Israel that Israelites could return and rebuild Jerusalem? What did the people of the land not want to happen? Sanballat, Tobias, and the others. That was a question for the class. What did they not want to happen? They didn't want Jerusalem rebuilt, did they? And they did everything they could to prevent the rebuilding of the city. Because at that time, cities represented power. And when you tore down the walls of the city, you tore down the people's power. Now we move into 2 Samuel chapter 13. And just to introduce the next segment of the book very quickly, 2 Samuel 13 through chapter 20. This is called a chiasm, and it's usually written something like this. And it's kind of opposites. In the middle of a chiasm, you find the focal event, and then on either side of it, you find opposite events that occur. And so we see here that Absalom's revolt begins in chapter 13 through about chapter 15. David fleeing Absalom happens in chapter 15 through 17. He gets advice, and then a decision is made in chapter 16 and 17. There are two runners that come and give David information in chapter 17. Then we have Ahithophel's death in chapter 17:23. Then the central focus of this story is the epic battle that occurs between David's armies and Absalom's armies in chapter 17 and 18. Absalom's death, mirroring Ahithophel's death, is in chapter 18:18. Two runners come to David to talk to him about Absalom's death in chapter 18. Then he gets advice and a decision is made again in chapter 19. And then he returns. Now he's fled Jerusalem in chapter 15, and now he returns in chapter 19. And then instead of Absalom revolting in the end, Sheba revolts in the end in chapter 20. And so that's kind of the opposites approach to a narrative on what these passages talk about. This entire section of Scripture is excluded from Chronicles. And that's not unusual. Chronicles had a purpose for being written. Samuel had a purpose for being written. And so, for one to exclude something that the other one includes, that isn't unusual at all. They're not meant to be just a mirror image of each other or a retelling of the exact same story. They have different purposes. And all of these events that occur here in chapters 13 through 20 of 2 Samuel actually occur between the events recorded in 1 Chronicles 20, verses 3 and 4. So, let's see. These are all the result of David's sin with Bathsheba. And when we look at David and we see through some of these stories how he acted, I just see that David probably was sitting there going, how can I exact judgment that I ought to exact when I'm guilty of the exact same sin? We'll deal with that a little bit more later. But I just think that a lot of times, when we look at how David reacted to some of these things that went on, and he should have acted with judgment against Amnon. He should have acted with judgment against Absalom. But I just see that David probably was sitting there going, this is all a consequence of my sin. It's all my fault. How in the world can I punish these people when this is my fault? And so if that's what happened, it crippled him. Now he had repented of his sin, but it still crippled him to do what he should have done in some of these instances. And we need to think about that. People will look at something, they lust after it, as James talks about, and then the final deed is done and the sin has been committed, and they think, oh, well, it was just a little sin. But sin has a crippling effect on our lives. And we need to seriously consider that whenever we're tempted to do something. It can cripple us for doing righteousness later on in ways that we can't possibly understand at the time that we're being tempted. And at the time that David was looking off there at Bathsheba, bathing in the water, and did not avert his eyes as he should have, he wasn't thinking about any of this. In chapter 12 and verse 11, chapter 12 and verse 10, there's no more peace in his family. All consequence of the sin that Nathan had foretold. His family disintegrates in verse 11. There is a fourfold retribution which David had pronounced upon the perpetrator of the sin that Nathan told him about. And of course the first retribution is that the child dies that he had with Bathsheba, the unnamed child. Then Amnon dies, and then Absalom dies. Amnon, who is the mother, is Ahinoam, the wife of David. Absalom dies, who was the son of Maacah, wife of David. And then Adonijah died after David died, who was a son of Haggith. And so David, by his sin, brought sorrow to these wives of his who were completely innocent of his sin. And so innocent people were hurt by this one little act that David did. Another thing we need to keep in mind. And I think that's an important reason that these stories are told to us. Every sin, every transgression of the law that is possible was committed by people under the Old Testament. And in the Old Testament, we find examples of these things being done. Now, maybe not the same technology. We can find pornography on the internet. They didn't have the internet, but they had pornography. And it had the same effect on people then that it does now. The technology may be changed, but the sin is always the same. And we have the examples of it throughout the Old Testament. And if we look at them, we can understand what sin does to us. We also can understand what righteousness does to us. And let me just stop here for a second and make a side point. Tomorrow is a day called Memorial Day, and we memorialize those who have gone to war for this country and been heroes who have died for freedom. There are many heroes of faith in the Bible. Do we memorialize them occasionally? Do we think about what they did and how they served God, perhaps going back and rereading the story of Abraham and his life, and just in our mind memorialize him? Do we think about Jacob and how he was faithful to God for 14 years while Laban, his father-in-law, was mistreating him, abusing him, and cheating him, doing everything he could to cheat him? Do we think about Joseph, who was unjustly sold into slavery, but kept his faith in God, that God would make it all turn out, even when he was thrown in prison for a crime he didn't commit? I think it would be good for us to maybe on Sunday afternoon after services to go back in the Old Testament and pick out a hero of faith and just memorialize them for a few minutes and think about what they did and how they served God in spite of the problems that were thrown up against them and the temptations. And let that serve as an inspiration to us for that week to walk uprightly. In chapter 13, verses 1 through 22, introducing what we're really going to be talking about this morning, and that is the story of Amnon and Tamar. Amnon is in love with Tamar. Then at the end, I'm just going to go back and forth here. Amnon starts out being in love with Tamar, and the word love here, I'm told, in the Septuagint is translated as agape. It wasn't the highest form of love. It was just obviously lust. But in the end, Absalom winds up hating Amnon. Tamar comes to help her brother Amnon, and in the end, she leaves his house in mourning, sorry that she ever came to help him. Amnon orders his servants out, and then he orders a servant to put Tamar out. Amnon orders Tamar to lie with him, and then Amnon orders Tamar to leave. And of course, in the middle, the central point, Amnon rapes Tamar. Cast of characters. Amnon is the man who has passion without any form of restraint, which is always a bad thing. Jonadab is a man who has wisdom without principle. And it's interesting to me that in this story, don't know how far we'll get in it, probably not too far, but Jonadab comes out of the story unscathed. And he's the architect of the sin. But he, as far as people are concerned anyway, there's no mention of Jonadab being brought to task for anything he's done. But he has wisdom without principle. Tamar has innocence without protection. Absalom has hatred without regard for who he's hating or who he's going to hurt in the process. And David has anger without justice. Again, I think perhaps a crippling, the part of the crippling effect of his sin with Bathsheba. Now we're told again and again throughout this story in all of these verses, 1, 2, 5, 6, 7, 8, 10, 11, 12, 20, and 35, it's thrown in our face that Amnon and Tamar are brother and sister. The law of Moses forbid a brother and sister to commit fornication. The penalty for that was death. And so Amnon deserved death. Tamar is actually the only recorded case of rape that she's actually recorded as having said no. You think back on that and to the other cases in the Scriptures, there really isn't any that we have a recording that she said no. Cannot do this thing. Now Joseph, when he was there with Potiphar's wife, said no. And she snatched his garment off as he ran out of the house. But we don't have any other women talked about that said no. I don't know what to make of that point exactly, except that it is a point. Let's go into our text and let's just see how far we get. This son of David, Amnon, and what order, was Amnon the eldest, a middle son, or was he the youngest of David? Take a guess, somebody. He was the eldest. He would have been the one in line to be king after David. Something to keep in mind when you think about how Absalom acted toward him. Absalom was about, I think, number 3 in the birth order. But it took one of Absalom's, Absalom had ambition. And it took one of his competitors out of the picture when he did what he did in the end. But Amnon is the man who has all of this, I don't know how to say this except to be blunt, so if it offends anyone, I apologize. Amnon has all of these hormones running around in his body, but very little brains. He wants his sister. He wants her so bad that he can't, starts making him sick. But he can't figure out on his own how to go about this. And so now comes his cousin Jonadab, who apparently is a very shrewd man. And Jonadab says, well, I'll tell you what to do. You pretend to be sick, and when your father comes to check up on you, you ask him to send Tamar over to bake some cakes in your sight. And he doesn't explain this anymore. Now, I don't know why, people say, well, why didn't Jonadab and Amnon talk about what to do next? Well, one of two things, I think, would be the answer here. Jonadab might have culpable deniability in case he was brought into the trial over this thing. Oh, I didn't know what, I just thought he wanted to talk to her, and she wouldn't talk to him. I don't know. That sounds a little bit flimsy. Or just simply at that point he figured that Amnon could figure it out on his own. His hormones would figure it out for him at that point. And I think that's more likely what happened here. But the plan is enacted in verses 6 through 11. Amnon lies down pretending to be ill, and so the king comes in, and Amnon says, please let my sister Tamar come and make me a couple of cakes in my sight, that I may eat it from her hand. And so David sent to the house for Tamar and said, go do this, take care of your brother. We don't have enough information here, but I wonder why it was that David didn't smell a mouse. Why would Amnon want Tamar to come nurse him back to health? There may be some more family dynamics going on here, or something about their customs that I'm not aware of, but it just seems to me like that David could have thought this thing through and said, why do you want Tamar? Why can't you have one of your servants nurse you back to health? Why can't the cook why doesn't the cook you already have make you some cakes in your presence? Why do you need Tamar? I don't know. But it seems, Jesus said we're to be wise as serpents but harmless as doves. We need to understand the ways of the devil. Not so that we can do those things and get away with them, but so that we can be aware of when others are pulling a fast one on us and trying to get us into sin that we then can't get out of. And most of the time, the sins that or the things that happen to people, if they had just thought it through ahead of time, they might could have gotten out of it. How many of you have ever gotten the email that says, I am Princess Abdullah so-and-so, and I have received, I have $4.5 billion in the bank of Czechoslovakia, and I need your help in getting it out. Delete. Don't even open it. But people actually fall for that. Go ahead, Keith. Good point. Excellent point. And you know, I think most of us here, all of us here this morning, well, a couple of us here have children, but most of us don't have children at home anymore that we're raising, but there are grandchildren around. What are we doing for them? Are we paying attention? And are we paying attention to how our children are taking care of our grandchildren? That's another thing that maybe we ought to look at, and in gentle ways, perhaps we can help our children to become maybe the parents that don't make some of the mistakes we made. We all make mistakes, but we can minimize them. Go ahead, Keith. Mm-hmm. Hard to bend it the right way. Yeah. Very good point. Yeah. Yeah. Mommy and Daddy won't give it to me, I go ask Grandma. Go ahead, Don. Absolutely. Mm-hmm. David was livid. But here again, I wonder if he wasn't also crippled by the fact that this is what I did. Took a woman I had no right to have and made her my own. But as with most entitled people, and I'll call Amnon entitled, I think he was, once he got what he wanted, he didn't appreciate it. As a matter of fact, he despised her. He calls her his sister before he rapes her. After he rapes her, when he tells the servant to put this out of my house, some manuscript or some translations insert, put this woman out of my house. We have I'm not going to go there. He doesn't, the word woman is not in the text. He says, put this out of my house. He doesn't even refer to her as a human being anymore. She's this. Just get rid of it. The New American Standard. The word woman's not in the Hebrew. Throw this out of my presence. Okay. Yeah. Well, according to Wayne's notes, Wayne's a Hebrew scholar, so I'm going to go with his notes, okay? The word woman actually isn't in the Hebrew text. And so, this happens a lot of times, though. When people, my father probably could have bought me that little red Mercedes when I was 17, 18 years old. And would I have appreciated it? Probably not. I think maybe, I like to think I would have. But so many of my friends were children of very wealthy parents. And I remember this one kid that his father got him that Chrysler supercar when they first came out with it, the Viper. Bought him one of the very first Vipers that they came out with. And within a week, the kid had it wrapped around a tree, and he didn't care. He was off to his dad, I want something different now. Oh, he wanted that car so bad, and his dad got it for him. And then within a week, he just destroyed the thing and said, I want something different. Wasn't any good. Go ahead. Yeah. That could be. I'm not willing to say that as definitely as you are, but that could very well be. I've seen that happen so many times. And we project that anger at ourselves on someone else. And that very, very likely is what this was. But the point that his sister makes to him is, there's a right way to go about this, and the way you're going about it is not the right way. Go ask our Father. He'll not withhold me from you. Well, would David have withheld her from him? The law said he should have. The law said he should have. I have an idea that this was just something she said to try to get away from him. I don't know that for a fact, but probably so. Because brothers and sisters were not allowed to marry at that time under the law of Moses. But no, he doesn't want to do things the right way. He wants it now. And as a result, when he gets what he wants, it's disgusting to him after it's over with. Maybe that's a good idea for us thinking about when we want something, how should we go about getting it? We'll stop there. And I'll have Wayne pick up at that point. Yeah. What?